Good day and welcome to the Strong Ambition Podcast. I'm your host, Rylan Qualley, and I am here to dive in what makes people ambitious and to help you live your own ambitious life. And I want to do this because I didn't know what it was to live an ambitious life until I got older, until I started getting into this field. I didn't realize what my own potential was. I was a slacker. I was a guy who wouldn't really try hard. And I continued to evolve my mindset and became an ambitious person. And today's guest is great for helping you power up that mindset. Laura Ceccarelli. She is actually my sister-in-law, and she has great experience. So I'll give you a little bit of a background on her. Her master's in kinesiology at University of Manitoba, and she's currently enrolled in a doctoral program of clinical psychology. Her research examined the influence of self-compassion on athletes' psychological and physiological responses to stress and recover better understanding of mental health among student athletes. And so she really talks so well on this, on the idea of compassion for oneself, whether you're an athlete or just an individual trying to change. And we dive really good into the practices of behavioral change, of trying to become someone new, trying to create better activity practices, nutritional practices around the mental practices that you would need to reinforce. A lot of these things I use, and then she even had some more that I really kind of forgot I had heard about that are so practical. So without further ado, here is Laura Ceccarelli.
Good day, Laura. How the heck are you?
Hello, good. I'm doing well. Glad to be here.
Well, I'm super pumped to have you on board. This is going to be a really fun talk. We've been back and forth, kind of setting this up for a while, and I'm always fascinated with your realm of your profession, and we both kind of came from the kinesiology, and you went into the psychological aspect, and it more and more became apparent to me how valuable that is. So why don't we dive right into this and have you kind of, introduce yourself to the listeners and the viewers to your background, how you started in kinesiology, and kind of where you're at now.
Sure. So hi, everybody. I'm Laura Ceccarelli, and currently I'm enrolled in the doctoral program in clinical psychology at the University of Manitoba. I'll tell you a little bit about my path and how I've kind of gotten here. So when I initially graduated high school, I remember thinking my initial plan was to go into medicine, and I ended up doing a couple of years of university and not really feeling like that was a total fit for me. And I was sort of planning to come back to school and trying to think about what I saw for myself in my career that would allow me to do the things that I loved and work in an area that I cared about. And I had grown up being an athlete. I played every sport. I loved athletics. I feel like it's given me so much, in my life, and, really made me into the person that I am. And so I'm really passionate about sport, but I remember kind of reflecting, through my time in sport and just thinking sport is so amazing, but sport is really hard, and there's not a lot of resources for people in that realm or that arena who are struggling. And is a lot of struggle, as there is in any, area of life. But I remember thinking if I could do anything, I'd really want to be able to help athletes kind of manage the ups and downs that come with sport. And I remember talking about that with somebody, and they were like, oh, athletic therapy. And I was like, okay. So I kind of looked into that. And I remember having, a former boss of mine actually kind of say to me, what, I think based on what you're talking about, you would really enjoy psychology and maybe even sports psychology. And that always seemed like a really good fit for me when she said that, because I have always been really passionate about health, and I'm a really big believer in, the way that we think and feel. Our mind affects our body and affects our health. And those two things, our emotional health and our physical health, are really not, all that distinct or all that separate. I think they're really connected. So that's kind of how I found my way back into psychology. I ended up doing a master's degree in kinesiology. And for me, again, like I just really enjoyed like the health side of things. I think kinesiology is great for that because it really does consider health more holistically. And I think psychology is, you know, a really interesting kind of addition to that in the kinesiology world. And then as I was doing my research in that, I really enjoyed it. I think I did, you know, had the opportunity to do a lot of interesting work. And I just sort of realized like more and more through my research in sports and other areas that, you know, like what I think we're really missing specifically in sport is addressing mental health, not just, you know, mental skills or, you know, mental strategies for enhancing performance, but really like trying to support athletes and, you know, being mentally well and providing them resources for that. So that's kind of how, so I ended up applying to the clinical psychology program. And that's how I found myself here where I am now. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at now and still on the train, but it's sort of become, I feel like my career has kind of shaped into this nice marriage of being able to look at health more holistically, but specifically kind of, you know, the impact of psychology and the mind on the way that we live our lives.
Very powerful stuff. It's very vital to appreciate that side of it all, right? And I think I was always focused on the movement and even the food. And then years and years and years later, I'm like, oh, you can't accomplish anything if your head's not right. And so I love that you went that route. And I think it's so valuable and it's very needed in this day and age to help individuals. And you had a really interesting thesis in your master's degree, right? It was about correct me if I'm wrong, or you're just going to correct me anyways. It's about the trauma, emotional trauma experiences that athletes elaborate for me, because I know I'm butchering this. So am I on the right page?
Yeah, close. So basically what I looked at with my master's study was whether or not how athletes kind of respond or relate to themselves when they experience stress impacts not only like how they feel psychologically and how they respond psychologically, but if that impacts how they respond and recover physically or physiologically. And so you're right in the sense that we specifically looked at like kind of like discrete or specific experiences that athletes had with failure. And so I'll kind of just give you in a nutshell of like what we did. So I had athletes basically come into the lab and I hooked them up to all this different equipment that measured the way that their body was responding. And I had them just kind of sit and chill for a minute. And then what I had them do was think about a time and really visualize and take them back to a time when they failed or experienced an event in their sport that had impacted them significantly. So for a lot of people, that was like, for a lot of people, it was an injury, which for a lot of athletes is traumatic. For a lot of people, it was like, a loss or a major mistake, or it was not being selected for something, or maybe it was more of an interpersonal, experience that happened. But what we had them do is sit and visualize and really go back to that experience and kind of relive it in the moment. And then we gave them sort of a recovery period. And we looked at whether or not athletes' levels of self-compassion, so the way that they relate to themselves when they're struggling, do they respond with kind of kindness and openness and care and, concern for themselves? Or do they respond very self-critically, very harshly, or just totally try to avoid it? Whether or not those things impacted the way that their body responded to that stressor.
Wow, that the compassion, the self-compassion, that must have been a very interesting kind of just rabbit hole to go down. Like, so did you find one way or the other? Did you find personality types within that?
Yeah, we actually did have some really interesting findings. So what we found specifically that was sort of novel was that athletes' levels of self-compassion was related to how their body responded under stress. So what we found was that athletes who were more self-compassionate, their bodies responded in a way that they were sort of, I won't go into all the details about it, but basically they gave off sort of a physical profile that was like less taxing on their system. It showed that, their body wasn't going into wasn't that it wasn't experiencing stress, but their parasympathetic nervous system, or the kind of rest and digest, or kind of calm branch of the nervous system, was more engaged, less withdrawn when they were experiencing stress compared to people who were less self-compassionate. And so I think that's really interesting, because it showed that, the way that we think about and relate to ourselves when we are struggling or when we are experiencing stress, it not only affects like how we kind of subjectively feel or psychologically, respond or feel, but that there's actually something different going on potentially in our body when we react in that way. And I thought that, was really powerful, because I don't think that's always the message that, you get as an athlete, or, for a lot of people who are trying to do difficult things and make changes that are hard, right? There's sort of this like, push through pain, or even like, just forget about it, like, don't think about it, just stay positive, and this was sort of an interesting finding to kind of challenge that a little bit and say, what, maybe there is another way that not only, maybe helps you feel better and feel more motivated, but that also like physically is less taxing on your system and kind of puts you in a better position to be able to, do the things that you want to do after the fact.
Absolutely. The less taxing is so valuable. And I mean, I dealt with a lot of boxers and coaching boxers, and I mean, I just know that anxiety that is like, could be 7 days away, and the person's sympathetic nervous system is going to be firing up, and every minute closer becomes more intense, and you see it in fighters an hour before, and now they're getting fired up, and they're just like, you're not fighting for another hour, you're literally vibrating on that very moment. And to come back to that in a memory, that this person, if they're very critical, they're going to go back to that place. I even find it really fascinating talking about this, because I really had to not let myself think or dream of boxing before I sleep, especially when I was a boxer. Even now I try not to, but it stimulates my adrenaline just instinctively, and just my body will get a little bit more, I don't want to say anxious, but just fired up intuitively. Mm-hmm. And I just wouldn't sleep, because it would actually wake me up a little bit, thinking about whether it's past or just visualizing boxing. It's a terrible way to go to sleep. I literally couldn't rest. And so when you talk about this, I find it really valuable for people to appreciate. And the fact that you had said that it in some way enhances performance, right? And this is, I think, coming out more and more for people to appreciate these autonomic nervous systems, the fight or flight and the parasympathetic. And you really only want the fight or flight when you absolutely need it. And we're having it stimulated like almost way too much. And we just don't realize that the parasympathetic can actually help your performance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I know it's hard to really assess, performance in a relationship to these sorts of things with that. And we didn't do that explicitly, but it certainly opened up, an interesting line of discussion and provided some preliminary, evidence that there might be something going on there, and that there could be benefits, whether that's with performance or recovery, or preparation, and just overall health, too, because like you said, if, we're constantly putting ourselves and our bodies in a state of stress unnecessarily, that over time can have, impacts on our body and on our health. And even in like, the more immediate short term, like, it's just easier to like make, good decisions or rational decisions, or to respond in a way that we want to, rather than responding emotionally or impulsively or with anger and frustration, when we're in a more calm, relaxed state. It's easier to do the things that usually we want to do than it is when we're stressed. And so I think that was, an interesting finding, and something that opened up, an interesting line of discussion, and certainly, made us realize, like, yeah, there's definitely more work that we can do here. And maybe, the approach that we're taking specifically in sport could look a little bit different.
Yeah, for sure. With just the value of mental performance is now far, it was interesting how like 10, 20 years ago, give it at least 20 years, and it wasn't very common actually even for strength training other than football players and bodybuilders. Then it's like, okay, it's evident now performance coaches are, trying to help athletes with this. And so I'm curious, within this, you probably had to do a lot of other side research and other articles and around this field. What are some other really interesting, cool findings that you came in regards to athletes and mental performance?
Yeah. So I think there is more research like in the sport arena when it comes to looking at the impacts of more like mental skills or mental performance on athletes' performance ultimately, or and that sort of thing. So I think, like, just overall, if I'm just going to speak generally about this, like, and I've also done some work looking at the impact of psychological factors on people, like, say, coping with a chronic disease or trying to be more physically active, if they're very inactive, and that sort of thing. And I think the thing that continues to strike me is just the impact that some of the psychological factors can have on these sorts of things, whether it's like trying to be more physically active, or trying to cope with a really difficult change in your life or a health condition. I think the impact of some of these more mental or psychological factors, I think more and more we're just seeing that they really do go a long way. And I think also, like, just it kind of illustrates that, like, anytime we're trying to do anything in our life, like whether it's change a behavior or cope with stress, like these things are complex. It's not just so simple as like, just do it. Like, there's a lot that you need to consider and that goes into that. And I hope that, just by even kind of recognizing that people can kind of give themselves a little bit of a break and, just see, like, it doesn't mean that I just need to look a certain way or have a certain set of skills to be able to do something. There are lots of different ways that, I can work on improving or making changes. So that's kind of I guess that's, like, to answer your question, that's sort of what I've found really interesting just generally, is just the impact of, like, the mind on the body. I mean, there's so much cool research around, like, imagery and how, like, just thinking about and visualizing, yourself doing something actually improves your ability to do it and your performance. And that, like, to me, I think that's really cool and shows the power of the mind. And that's just not just in sport, but in, like, health context more broadly. The area that I've been pretty passionate about has been, again, looking at the impact of, the mind, or the way that we respond to stress, or the way that we, sort of relate to ourselves emotionally or cope with emotions, impacts what's happening in our body. And, like, what sorts of things we can do to kind of optimize that process, help ourselves recover better, help put our bodies in a better state to be able to emotionally do the things that, we want to do. So yeah, that's been something that I've also really enjoyed.
I think that's a huge realm that it needs to be more understood and, like you said, respected. That this is, you got to forgive yourself for not knowing how to do things, and it's going to take a while before you mentally feel okay doing things. It's like you say, it's just so not as simple as execution. I always give people the examples of you got to do something to your car, YouTube it, you could do it, but you don't do it because you don't know how to do it, because it's not something you're comfortable doing. And a lot of practices, whether it's training itself, nutrition, and any health practices, like it takes a while to get good at something, especially if you've never done it, right? And so I appreciate that value of you got to give yourself some forgiveness and leeway to understand. And the worst thing is like the overnight stories that, oh, it was really easy, it was quick and it was fast, and then people believe that that's where they should be. So I want to run off this a little bit because this is a real practical, valuable stuff for people to understand. Let's start with the physical practice, and I want to talk about nutritional behavior change as well. But when you see, or what you have seen or researched anything based on that, because you had talked about how the mental effects of physical, and I'm not sure if you would have read the book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Have you heard of this?
No.
No, it's Robert Polanski, and he talks about the impact stress has on the body physically, when it could be psychological stress or just poor metabolic health, and it's fascinating. But what kind of things have you seen in relationship to the basically people having a hard time with physical activity, behavior change, and the mental hurdles that they have to overcome?
Yeah, for sure. I think there are a lot of challenges that come with like making changes in your behavior, because a lot of times, like, you've been doing the same thing for a number of years. And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges, is that people, like, whether it's, being more active or eating better, or even just like trying to do things differently or feel better emotionally, is that people try to do what they've always done. And then they get really upset with themselves when it doesn't work, or they get really upset with themselves when they try something new and it doesn't work right away. Or they, quote unquote, fail at it early on, and they kind of just throw in the towel. So I think that's something that, in and of itself, I think is a really big challenge, is just really trying to recognize that, I maybe haven't done this before. I maybe haven't done this in a long time. Or, this hasn't really been how I've been living my life so far, or for a long time. And that's going to take a little bit of time for me to kind of figure out how that works for me. And I think there are certainly a number of ways that, we can make that a little bit easier on ourselves. Is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah, and that's exactly what I wanted to get to.
Yeah.
Was like, how do you recommend people have these conversations with themselves? Because that's, again, I'll go back to how I believe mainstream media is a huge core to the problem, is that they see, thousands of people that are on social media that are getting it done fast and quick, and they make it sound easy, but that's thousands out of millions. So it's a low percentage, and you never see the after and all that stuff. So what are kind of some things that, like, because those are huge mental battles, that you recommend people try to practice?
Yeah, for sure. I think for one thing, like, there's a few things I think that are sort of at the core of this. Like, the first that comes to mind for me is that nobody is going to do anything that they don't want to do. Like, that's just like a fact, or they're definitely not going to do it for very long. So I think, like, you talk about motivation a lot, or, we hear about motivation a lot, but I guess what I mean by motivation is just, I don't know that at the outset of, whether it's starting an exercise program or, eating differently, that people really think like, why am I doing this? And I think if they do, oftentimes it's like either to, like, lose weight or be healthy. And like, at face value, those should be like totally motivating for all of us, right? And they are, and they're still, worthwhile pursuits if that's, what you're going for, and that's what's appropriate for you. But the reality is that, like, well, for one, we don't know when we're going to die and how we're going to die or what we're going to die from, or from what cause. So, the pressure of that, so to speak, is pretty far away, potentially. Like, it's not like we really feel the immediate impact of that. Same thing, like, even just with our health, like, more generally, right? Like, if we're, overall, like, fairly healthy, it's hard. Sometimes those really significant health, impacts that can come later in life, we don't necessarily feel like, the pressure or the motivation from those things, because they're just kind of far away. So I think really thinking about like, not just because I want to be healthier and because I want to lose weight, but really trying to think like overall, what's important to me in my life, like what really drives me or fulfills me, what matters to me, and how does making these changes impact that stuff. And, I have these same conversations with athletes is like, how does you being an athlete, or you continuing to train, or you, continuing on this pursuit, impact these other areas of your life. And I get them to think like about all aspects of their life. Like if family is something that's really important to them, like how does this impact, their family? Like maybe, having this passion and going down this path has allowed them to, be closer to their family or set a good example for people who, matter to them in their life. To have these, important experiences that, they maybe wouldn't have had otherwise. I even get people to think like if, their faith or spirituality or religion is important to them, like how do these changes impact that? Or how might they, impact that for the better? So I think trying to really think about at the outset of making any change, like, why do I want to make it? Am I really prepared and in a position to make those changes? Or how much change can I make given my, current situation and the motivation that I have? And trying to also really keep those whys, or those values like really close to you throughout the process, because, health, like my one friend who's a chiropractor, she says something like, uses this quote all the time along the lines of like, health is a journey, and like it's kind of depressing, but she says like health is a journey and like our destination is death. And so but what that means essentially is that like we need to make like hundreds of thousands of decisions about our health every day, and that can be very exhausting, and you're going to need the emotional fuel, to continue to make these decisions day in and day out. And so I think trying to not only think about that at the outset, but kind of keep that motivation close to you, as you go along, whatever your journey is, whether that's like keeping reminders on your phone or pictures on your phone that remind you of like why you're doing this, or writing them down and keeping them close, or journaling about them, at the end of a day. Like, I think really trying to kind of, insert those things, at times when you need them is really important. And I think something that, again, people don't really think about. They sort of think that if I have enough motivation at the beginning, then I'll just stick with it. And it's not true. Like, it's hard, and all these decisions can wear on you after time. So that's a big one for me, is really thinking about like your why for doing something.
Yeah, well, it's funny because that's what I always tell people. When I had Jason Brooks on here, I said the same thing. He said those exact words you said: keep it close to you. And it's so important that people understand that losing weight, which, inherently it's just you want to look good, probably look good naked. I get that. But, and then even just like, or not dying, both those are in and of themselves are going to be long-term goals. Definitely the health has to be long-term. But even like weight loss is going to take a long time. And the moment it doesn't seem like it's working at the rate you want it, it's going to cause this problem, right? And so what is the reason that because it's just a question of when you run out of motivation on that premise, right? Because, I always talk about the instant gratification that we're not, and you can tell me if I'm wrong or right on this, is more the ancestral mindset approach to psychology that humans might have, is that we're so much more used to feeding ourselves and doing our job for the day. We are now modern creatures that have years to plan for, and for us to plan months in advance is kind of crazy, right? As just Homo sapiens. So now you're going to tell someone, change your behavior and make you uncomfortable every day, and you're going to feel good about this in maybe 6 months, maybe a year, 2 years. So if you don't have like the relationship that you spoke about, is what I think is so important, is the value of, you do this exercise all of this stuff gets better. And that is like a really hard thing to communicate to people, right? And so I'm curious, if is it through the process, I suppose, of really counseling people to get them to really believe in the association, because that's what I always think is one of the biggest battles for people who are or are new to exercise, is believe that this is going to work versus, well, they're going to believe just, skipping a workout here or there or every week isn't a big deal, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think like, the belief thing is a tough one. And, it's also hard to kind of have faith in a process that maybe you've never been down before, right? I think it's the same thing like when people are in therapy, right? Like a lot of times too, I think it's the same thing with exercise or, eating, is that things often feel worse before they feel better. And, it's often a good sign actually, if they do, like if it feels like, oh, this workout like kicked my ass and I'm sore and, I'm tired, or if like you're in therapy and you're like, wow, that was emotionally like really tough. Like, that's actually a good sign. That means that you're like doing some good work. But like you said, that sort of pleasure principle is that like we as humans, like we love doing what feels good in the short term and avoiding what feels bad. And so I think just, what can help with that is trying to think a little bit about, your behavior, whether that's like exercising or not exercising, or, eating well or not, or, numerous other health behaviors that you can think about, and really try to think about, what are the benefits in the short and the long term. And also like what function is not doing these things or doing something different instead of these things actually serving me in the short and the long term. A lot of times what people will find is that, when we, skip a workout or, I don't know, get off the train, in some capacity, or not do things that, bring up anxiety or fear, or discomfort for us, is that in the short term, we kind of feel a little bit of relief. But in the long term, we feel worse. And then we only feel more anxious and more stressed or, worried when we're put in these situations again, and then we're even less likely to do them. But what we find often is that if we just do it, that actually reduces our anxiety and we're more likely to do it again. And so I think like, when that comes to like making behavior changes and that sort of thing, I think there's a couple things there that, you can kind of draw on. I think the first is really trying to be honest and realistic about like, what is the smallest step that I could take in the right direction for this thing. And I think I always encourage people with that. And at first people are like, oh my God, I rolled, like, this is so pointless, but like success is more motivating than failure. And so, like the smallest step in the right direction, the more times that you can do that, the better. And you're actually going to see that like, over time, and probably in not a very long time, like you're going to get actually quite a bit closer to where you want to be. But I think that's one mistake that people make, is they try to do like too much too soon. And not just with like physical activity, like it can be with anything. They're like, oh, I'm just like cleaning out my pantry and I'm not going to eat like sugar for another like 3 years. And it's like, okay, like that's probably, not going to happen, or not even realistic or what you really even want. So I think just trying to make like the smallest changes that you can, like, to be honest, like sometimes it's like, if what helps you is just like the minute you come home from work, like just put your running shoes on. Or like, I'm just going to commit to myself to doing like one lunge. And if I want to do more than that, then great. And if I don't, then like, that's what I did for today. And I did more than I would have done otherwise by just skipping this. So I think like really trying to take like the smallest possible steps in the right direction can be a really effective strategy. And I think over time, people often find more success with that and have a better ability to maintain some of these changes rather than trying to do that really like extreme, restrictive or, like really extreme approach. So I think that's one side of that. And just quickly, I'll mention this before I forget it, but I think the other part of this is like really trying to do what you can to make the changes that you make enjoyable. And so like whether that's with food or exercise, like I think you've probably heard me say this before, and I'm sure other people have said this to you too, like the best exercise that you can do is the exercise that you are going to do, you know, and that you like doing. And if there's nothing that you like doing, then maybe you need to try to, you know, add enjoyment to it in some way, whether that's like with music or doing a show or doing it with somebody else, you know, that sort of thing.
I fully agree that the value of exercise experience is so inherently important, and it's what's, you need to have these little intrinsic motivators, right? And you have to have the experience itself to be, and certainly in the start, you kind of described it, it's tough, but it's tough because you're not used to it, and then you don't believe in it too much, and so you know, especially with strength training, people become more resistant to it because of the fact that they don't know they're going to feel better from this experience. So all the pain and the frustration and the discomfort from that doesn't have much value. It's just uncomfortable. And then all of a sudden it starts getting better. But if you can create this routine and structure for someone that, hey, you know what, I kind of like this part of it. Like, this is why I would never want to really necessarily do a Zumba class routinely. I personally haven't even done cycling classes. But if people want to show up to those, then do it, right? And I think like it's so valuable to have that as part of an experience that you want to do, not because you necessarily have to do it. The only thing we have to do, to some degree, it is still our choice, is something. You know, it's just like we got to try to, if we want to have, you know, health and all these things, there is something that we have to do. But no, I think that's very good. I love how you put that in there, and also that it's so valuable to talk about the small steps, because I talk about, you know, 2 to 3 degrees one direction, you know, rather than just, a lot of people will talk about, I need to do a 180, and they end up doing a 360 because they go all the way around and they come back to the original direction, right? And they just don't stop turning, and it's too much, it's too extreme. And so, you know, I've been on calls with some people where I'm about to sign them up, and I'm like, no, like, you don't have to do that. Like, what if this is like you're telling, but then they say, oh, but I go hard, I do it good. Yeah, but you're not doing anything now, so this isn't good, right? So if it didn't stay to be a part of your life, then there's a problem with your original structure. And like you had said, people just have a hard time believing a little bit is enough. But I think what they don't see is it's about the character change that has to be long-term and slow and boring, but then it kind of becomes you, right? It's like, that's how it becomes you, is because it's slow and it's inherently easy to do something a little bit hard, right?
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things that you said there, you know, that stand out to me. Like, one thing I just wanted to mention, you know, some of the research that I did while I was doing my master's was around like looking at like what sorts of things help people to make changes, like with regards to being more active and actually sustain those changes. And what, you know, a lot of studies, or a few studies, have shown is that people who chose to and continue to exercise just for like the social aspect actually sustained their exercise changes longer than people who had started initially for their health. You know, so again, I think it speaks to that piece around like enjoyment, you know, and just kind of knowing yourself, like, you know what, you know, sorts of things actually help you to make these changes or make it more fun or make it more enjoyable for you, and actually try to, you know, build those into the changes that you're making, rather than just expecting yourself to be like downstairs on the treadmill for an hour by yourself when that's something you don't do and don't like doing already, you know? So I think that's, you know, an important piece as well. And then there was something else that you said there that I was going to comment on. And now I'm losing my train of thought, but you were just talking about, the small steps, right?
Yeah, small steps, and just the inherent value for enjoyment itself, right? And no, I think all of these are very helpful, and I think we can flip a lot of this very easily into nutrition. Oh, I actually did want to point this out, and I forgot about this, but because you had such a good point of being aware of what you're not doing. And I'm going to talk about how I do this in nutrition in the opposite sense. So what I think is actually really valuable, and you had described this, and I'm going to use this more often for people because I think it's very important, is if we don't track what we're not doing, it's actually an important metric, right? So if you skip a workout, you go another week without working out, you go some days without training, you put this off, you put that off. Putting it off makes it kind of like cancel out that it never happened, right? So now there's like, to them, it's no metric, it's not there, it's not real. Now, this is a problem on two folds. If we're talking about skipping workouts and doing the training you should do, that's a problem, right? Because you're literally not going to keep a mental note of, I skipped so many workouts because it just didn't happen, right? It's not how many workouts I did, it's just skipping. And then on the other side, when I talk about this with food, is I talk about willpower points. And I think it's a very valuable thing to do when someone is in an environment that has very tempting food routinely. And what you should do is track what you're not doing when it's tempting. And so I say, give value to that moment of resistance. You rate a food 1 to 5 at its, for enjoyment. So to me, a cookie or M&Ms is like 5 out of 10, or sorry, 5 out of 5. And then if I overcome things or I see something, I add it up. And at the end of the day, and I'll literally have Angelina, she'll message me like, yeah, I had like a 24-point day. It's like, that's a tough day. And that makes you feel better about it. So I just think it was really cool that you pointed that point, the idea of missing, because I do this in food, and you should track what you don't do because you should feel good about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a few things there. I think like you said, a lot of times, like when, not like for anyone, like the fault of anyone, but like a lot of times, like, we've talked about that, we try to avoid the things that don't feel good. And it doesn't feel good to like look at our phone on your app, and see like, oh, I missed my workout or, whatever. And so, sometimes it does just feel easier to like not have a record of that, or not really look at that a little bit more critically. And I think that's why a lot of times, like, regardless of what domain we're talking about, that people can kind of find themselves, doing the same things, or kind of enacting the same patterns over and over again. And I think what we know is that even just by trying to be more aware of what we're doing, whether that's with tracking or writing things down, or even just kind of stopping and reflecting, like, why am I doing this right now? Like, what benefit does it have to me in the short and the long term? And what drawbacks does it have in the short and the long term? I know you're not going to do that for every decision you make every day, but, kind of thinking about that a little bit more in like the bigger picture, just bringing awareness to some of these things actually can be a really effective way of making because sometimes what we always do, and it's like almost automatic, right? And then we expect ourselves to behave differently, and that's just not really realistic. So I think that's a big, I'm a big proponent of that, is just trying, like, anytime we're trying to make a change, is just trying to be more aware, and not aware in like a judgmental way, but just aware in like, what's really going on for me here, and like, what am I actually doing or not doing? And I think on the flip side of that, like you said, we just like at a fundamental level as human species, or like, we're not designed to like look for all the good stuff, right? Like, we're designed to like keep ourselves alive. And that means being aware of threats and, being aware of things that, don't feel good or could harm us. And so we're always going to look out for, the negative. And that can be like, psychological things too, or, things that are imagined, like fears or worries, not just like actual threats in our environment. And so I think really trying to be intentional and purposeful about like, what did I do well today? Like, what were my like small wins today? Or what steps did I take in the right direction today? Is really important. That's something that we do with athletes a lot. Because they, are designed to critique everything, and to always look for like, what's that like millimeter of an edge or improvement that I could have made. And they find that really helpful, like just really trying to purposely focus on, what went well, or what did I do that, was in the right direction for me today.
I really appreciate that sentiment. And it's just going into being a bit more, like we started talking about, compassion for yourself. When you have some flaws and you're trying to work towards something, it'll keep you more level-headed and clear. It keeps you more mindful of what you're doing. And I think this is where I kind of want to get into the food conversation, because this is where people torture themselves, me being one of them, where just like, I've been to the end of, just over consuming food. And then, I would go through self-loathing the next day, and then rinse, repeat. It could be weekly, sometimes daily. I would go on good streaks. I'd yo-yo, right? And you end up creating this really poor relationship with food. But when I calmed down, and it was the simplest thing. It wasn't the simplest thing. I'd say it was practice. It was being more mindful. Meditation helped me go through this, is trying to acknowledge something that you experience without being judgmental. It is such a skill, right? Because it's taking a step back from your conscious state, right? You become self-aware, and you can, you had said this before, ask why. Like, instead of just, this is what I did, I fucked up. It's, okay, but why did I fuck up? Like, what led to this moment? And honestly, as soon as I started doing that, the moments really stopped happening, or I just started to acknowledge them. I started to recognize the behaviors going into it. So what kind of practices around that, around mindfulness, especially around food, and controlling, having a better relationship with food, what kind of practices would you recommend people consider?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I'll speak about mindfulness and just kind of behavior change, maybe a bit more generally. I think if, this is something that people are really struggling with, and it does seem to be, a little bit more extreme, or causing them more distress, or more, disruption in their lives, that they should talk to their doctor, or, see a professional who can help them with this. But I think just in general, like, for all of us, like, food, does and should, like, bring, some pleasure. Sometimes it can bring comfort, in times when we're struggling, lots of different things. Right. So I think, like, in general, just like trying to be aware of, like, where food fits into, like, your life in that way. Like, we need food, we need to eat. So it's not like, that's something that needs to change, but just really trying to think about, like, in what ways maybe does, food help me cope, and cope with what, like, is it that it's when I feel really stressed, or when I feel anxious, or when I feel sad, that these things, I tend to go to these things, and what are maybe other ways, that, bring me that same relief, but that maybe doesn't have the same, like, long-term consequences, that, eating stuff does, if that's something that's become, more of an ongoing problem for you. There's nothing wrong with, having food that you enjoy, or having a treat, or whatever, when you want to, like, there's nothing wrong with that. Right. I think that's another big thing, is really only if it's become a problem for you. Or if you're wanting to make some changes in that area. But like I said, really trying to think about, like, what purpose is that serving for me in the short term, like in the immediate term, and in the long term.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think for most people, they find, I was just going to say, is that, like, in the short term, you get relief, but in the long term, you kind of have more of those same emotions that you had in the first place. So it's not like it really got rid of those things. It just kind of pushed the pause button on them, and then you feel worse for, doing something that you feel bad about. And often people can be very critical or judgmental about that, which activates their stress response system. Right. And, it can be like a very cyclical process or pattern, that people get into. So that's another thing I would say too, is just trying to notice when you do those things, notice how you're feeling in those moments, and trying to give yourself a little bit of kindness or understanding, instead of, that judgment or self-criticism. I'm big on self-compassion. I can talk about this for a really long time, but we actually know that people who respond with more self-compassion, like more of that awareness, like rather than just kind of sweeping it under the rug, more kindness, and kind of that understanding that, like, everybody does this, it's not just me who goes through this, like, everybody makes mistakes, or everybody, slips up when they're trying to do something new or trying to stick to a program or whatever that is. And I'm not alone in this. People who respond in that way actually, get back on the train faster. They stick with changes longer. They take more initiative to make improvements, so there's actually a lot of benefit to that too. And I can talk a bit about that at the end, just as far as like resources that people can use for that.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Well, yeah, and like, I mean, so you really hit a lot there that I was curious about, is like, what kind of major practices do you think? And I think just this has been the theme, right? Self-compassion is like such an important concept for you to improve, right? Rather than staying in the raw emotion of whatever you're challenged with yourself. If especially in this discussion, right? Like and this is just more my view, right? Not coming from your practice experience, but everything's kind of hitting home here, is like, when I stopped letting just the emotion sit in the memory, right? And I asked what else was in the memory, I could find out more details. I could find out the problem. And even literally, the idea of that concept of self-forgiveness, when I would literally say, forgive it, man. Like, you did it. It's done. You ate a lot of food. It's okay. And what led to that moment. And it was so, all of a sudden, it was like fog started to clear up, right? It wasn't all this hate and anger and self-loathing that was always just the distant memory. Now it was like there was details there to be discovered. And I think this is kind of why I just think it's so practical for you to give this perspective. And I'm curious, what other major mistakes or even just recommendations do you think you would encourage people to focus on when it comes to improving behavior change itself?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to recap, so we talked a little bit about like kind of knowing your whys, trying to make things more enjoyable, and also self-compassion. I think like one of the things that I see a lot, and we kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, but is that people sort of just expect themselves to be able to like make these changes like the next day, like without even really having to give it much thought or anything. And I think, we really can't underestimate the value and the effectiveness of planning when it comes to these sorts of things. And, it's funny because I feel like it's the same thing, I think, when it comes to like, our emotional health or, exercise or nutrition, is that for some reason, like people just think that they should just be able to like figure this out or do it, without thinking about it. And, if you think about anything else in your life that you need to do that matters to you, like you would never just like drop your kid off at school and be like, oh, like, I hope they get home like from school, eventually, or like, like, I guess I'll just start work like whenever I feel like it tomorrow. And finish like whenever I feel like it. Like, we work well having structure and having given things like a little bit of forethought and thinking about like, what is it going to look like in my day and how am I going to like plan for this and make it work? So I really think like it's I feel like it's simple, but it's a really effective strategy is, planning for like the changes that we want to make. And I mean it, like writing it in your agenda, like really thinking about, okay, like what do I need in order to do that? Like, what do I need to prepare now? Or what can I do now that's going to make it more likely that I'll do that, tomorrow? And then I think the other side of that, is maybe even more missed than planning itself, is planning for setbacks, or planning for challenges or barriers, that are going to make those changes hard. So I think a lot of times we sort of plan, like we get it in our agenda and we're like, hey, I'm doing it this time. But then like, I don't know, something comes up at work and you get home late, or, your kid is sick and you're not able to do something. And so I think like not just planning for the activity itself for everything to go well, but planning for like, okay, if X happens, then what am I going to do?
Yeah.
And this is actually getting a lot with athletes is, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was saying I love that. It's freezing occasionally, but keep going. I love this thought process.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, we do this with athletes a lot too, is we get them to think about and visualize like not only like their perfect event or perfect race or perfect execution, but we actually get them to think like, okay, what could go wrong? And now I want you to imagine yourself like in that situation, having that come up and really try to think about and visualize like, okay, what can you do when that comes up? And so you really see yourself doing that. Like, what can you say to yourself? And really see that yourself doing that, all those sorts of things. And I think, the same can really apply when it comes to food or physical activity, and trying to maintain or make changes in those areas is really thinking like, okay, but like, yeah, I want to do this and I need to have certain things in place to be able to do that. Like that's step one. But step two is like, what's going to get in the way of me doing this, and really being honest about that and actually thinking through that. Because what we actually know, like from the research too, is just that even having thought about that in advance makes it more likely that we're going to respond in a way that we want to when that stressor comes up. Because, we've all been there. When we're stressed, it's hard to think about an alternative. We're just going to do what we always do. We're going to like not do the workout and just sit and watch Netflix, or, we're going to eat that thing that, we didn't want to, whatever it is, because that's just what's easiest. And that's like what we know. Right. But if we had actually, sort of thought like, okay, when this comes up, what am I going to do about it? Or how can I, make sure plan for, being able to kind of stick with this or do what I want to do.
Very, very key information there. And I honestly forgot about that mindset tactic. I do always tell people that you have to plan that things are going to come up, but the planning itself, I've literally transformed people by getting them to use agendas in their calendars, and it go figure, behavior change because they planned for it. But the idea of planning for failure, or the challenge that's going to come, the obstacle that's going to overcome, is so vital. It was really cool to hear GSP, like the MMA fighter, said that 20% of the time he would visualize it going wrong. He said 80% of the time going right, but he was mentally prepared. Because if you imagine as a performer, an athlete, I wasn't ready for this scenario. I thought I was, imagine a fighter. I thought I was always going to kick his ass. Well, that's a problem, because that's not how it works, right? And in so many people, when they're training too, I yell at boxers all the time. I'm like, assume it's probably not going as well as you think. And that's a problem when people are shadowboxing in bags on their own, because no one's hitting them back, right? So they don't know how to practice that preparation. But no, and just the practicality of, okay, mentally putting yourself in that spot, emotionally visualizing it, how it feels to have this tough day after work, or to have this emotional stressor that's going to make you think, oh, I kind of want that food or whatever it is, and to imagine how you need to overcome it. Right there, it's a mental rep, right? And I think that's such a really cool concept for people to think about and to plan to do routinely.
Yeah, totally. No, I do think it's really important. And like, just like, it's not in our human nature to want to think about things that don't feel good, right? Like, and we hear that all the time. People are like, just stay positive, or just think about the positive. And there's value in that. But I think when we kind of ignore or disregard, some of that discomfort, or that potential discomfort, or, quote unquote, like negative, experiences, or things that bring up some of that difficult stuff for us, then we actually don't really do ourselves any favors, when those situations do come up, because we can't avoid them, like it's just, human nature. Like we're going to experience stress, and that's not a bad thing. But, if we feel like we can face it and we can manage it, and we have a little bit of an idea of how we can do that, we're more likely to manage it in a way that we want to, or that's maybe a little bit more helpful for us, rather than just kind of reverting back to, maybe what we've done in the past or hasn't worked for us.
Yeah. And I like how you keep referring to that. Like, you're going to revert back to your old routine if you don't really think about these new strategies to become someone new. That right there, it's an identity change. And I don't think people appreciate that. And like you had said, like the other thing I wanted to allude to when you're talking about planning is just, You think you're just going to implement this, you're just going to implement it. And even if you implement it, like, you're not going to be good at it. It's going to be hard. It's going to be tough. And like, think about how many things we already talked about, and it could still fail, right? And so it's like there's some perseverance in trying to build a new character. There just has to be, because you're trying to create someone new that is not your norm. And so when you keep saying reverting back, it's like, it's going to take some reps, right? It's going to take that discomfort as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like you said, it's going to take like, repeated practice, of all of these things. But I think that's something interesting, like when it comes to like kind of seeing yourself in a different way, or, making, exercise or eating well at the part you are. Some of the research shows us that these things that I've talked about, like enjoyment, planning, like believing that you can do something and that you're capable of doing it, showing commitment to something, or figuring out how you can show commitment to something, all do, impact, over time, your ability to see yourself in that new way. And that was actually one of the studies that I was involved in during my master's research, is, looking at how can we change some of these variables associated with identity, for people who haven't, been active. And that's actually what we did, is we designed an intervention that targeted all of these different variables. So help people think about like how they could enjoy exercise more, help them think about why they exercise, help them think about like, how they show commitment or could show commitment, or what would enhance their commitment to exercise, their planning. And I'm trying to think back which one I'm missing: ability, commitment, wanting, trying. I think that's all. And enjoyment. Yeah. And we found that people actually, like, by working on these things over time, by the end of the intervention, did, see themselves more as an exerciser, or did see that aspect of their life becoming a part of, who they were, or who the way that they saw themselves. So, that's kind of interesting.
That's awesome. And I mean, it's great to know you have that firsthand experience, so people can hear that, hey, we've seen this work. It's not just, rubbish. It's been practiced. And I think that's the thing, is people got to try some of these things, and really all of them are going to be that it is that hard to change your behavior, right? Because it's so embedded in you. But I know you got to put my niece down here right away. So we're going to wrap up here. I always ask all my clients this, so I'm just curious what's kind of in the pipeline. What's your most recent ambition? What's really getting you going?
Yeah. So I've been in school for a long time. And I mean, at this point, it doesn't really feel like school. Like, I'm not like taking classes like all day, every day. I get to do a lot of like really practical and fun stuff that I really enjoy, and that sort of thing. But I'm like almost done my doctoral degree. So that's something that's really driving me right now, that I'm working towards. It's just like getting that wrapped up. And like, you mentioned your niece, like I just had a baby. So really just trying to get back to like my, clinical practice, after being pretty removed from that for a little while, is something that I've been feeling really excited about. And even just doing stuff like this, is great to, use that side of my brain again, and get to reach out to people in this capacity. So yeah, that's probably the major thing that's going on for me.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Laura, for joining today. I really appreciate it. I think this was a really, really helpful discussion for all my listeners and all my clients. So probably have you on down the road when you're getting more into even more of the research, and brainstorm a few more ideas and concepts, as I like going down these rabbit holes. So thanks again. I really appreciate it, and you have a great night.
Okay, thanks, Rylan.
Thanks again to Laura Ceccarelli for that wonderful conversation. I generally felt like that was a great conversation, not just because it was a good conversation, but a practical one because we really uncovered the tools and real ideas and concepts that you can take home as a tool to improve yourself and even myself, like even these ideas that I didn't actually remember to actually utilize when it comes to, concepts around tracking. Especially I'd mentioned the idea of tracking when you don't have exercise versus have exercise. And we also talked about, which I found interesting, was preparing for when things go wrong, because it's not if, it's when. And I always tell people that, but I think it's a huge lesson for myself to remind myself and my clients of, let's start preparing for these challenges. Let's prepare for when you don't want to train. Like, how are you going to overcome that? How are we going to overcome the moment of, well, that favorite treat of yours is on the table, chocolate chip cookies. What are you going to do? I know for myself, it's hard, but if we can visualize going through that, maybe even dealing with the chance of slightly dealing with the failure, how do you overcome these things? And it's mental preparation. I think that was one of the most practical tools there for myself. And I really believe that if you won't go through that conversation with a pen and paper, you could probably write down quite a few ideas and try to implement one. Try to put it in your calendar, because as we had said, you got to plan. You got to actually make an intent to plan. And so, it was also just reassuring for me, because a lot of the other stuff that we talked about, like planning and making small steps, so many of these concepts are exactly what I encourage in practice with my clients in our NEM series in the mindset section. And so it's very reassuring for me that I'm on the right track, that someone who studies clinical psychology really believes in all of these ideas as well. So I think it's just really great that you got to come on here and solidify these concepts for myself and add a bit more. And I hope you all learned from this. And with that being said as well, just remember, if you are having a hard time implementing it, because it's one thing to have these ideas and concepts and tools, but that's where a coach comes in. And so that's where I know for myself, when I got a coach is when I made change. And so if you're having a hard time implementing training and nutrition in your life, check out my website, rqtrainingnutrition.com, or my Instagram, rqtrainingnutrition. And this is exactly how I try to help people make the change, because the training is an idea and the nutrition is an idea until it's an action. And to create that action, you need the mindset. And that's what I try to support the most with my clients. So other than that, though, I got to mention that it's not about the pursuit of happiness, but remember, it's the happiness within the pursuit.